When my best friend Sarah signed her divorce papers that Tuesday morning, I looked at her across the table and felt something break inside me too. She had been married to a man who cheated on her for 3 years while she stayed loyal and stupid and hopeful. I watched her hands tremble as she put down the pen, and I thought about my own situation. My own secret. My own betrayal that was somehow worse than hers, even though nobody would believe me if I told them. Sarah looked up at me with tears streaming down her face and asked if I was okay. I wasn't okay. I hadn't been okay for 7 years. But I smiled and told her she was brave and that she deserved better, and all the things best friends are supposed to say when someone finally escapes a toxic marriage. She hugged me tight and whispered that she couldn't have done this without me. I held her back and wondered if she would still love me if she knew what I was hiding. That night I went home to the house I grew up in. The house where my mother died when I was 16. The house where my father raised me alone after she was gone. The house where everything changed when I turned 21 and my father looked at me differently for the first time. I parked in the driveway and stared at the front door for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. My father was waiting in the living room like he always was. He smiled when he saw me and asked how Sarah was doing. I told him she had finalized her divorce today. He nodded and said that was probably for the best, that her husband had never deserved her anyway. Then he patted the couch next to him and asked me to sit down. I sat on the chair across from him instead. Something flickered in his eyes, but he didn't comment on it. We had dinner together like we did every night. He had cooked my favorite meal, chicken parmesan with garlic bread and a salad with the dressing I liked. He poured me a glass of wine and told me about his day at work. He was a respected surgeon at the hospital, beloved by his patients and colleagues, known for his steady hands and kind bedside manner. Nobody would ever suspect him of anything. Nobody would ever believe me. After dinner he suggested we watch a movie together. I said I was tired and wanted to go to bed early. He looked disappointed but said he understood. As I walked past him toward the stairs, he reached out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was gentle but firm. He said he missed spending time with me, that I had been distant lately, that he hoped I wasn't pulling away from him. I looked at his hand on my wrist and felt sick. I went to my room and locked the door behind me. I sat on my bed and stared at the wall and thought about Sarah signing those divorce papers. She had escaped. She had found the courage to leave someone who hurt her. Why couldn't I do the same? Why was I still here in this house, eating his food, pretending everything was normal, acting like a daughter when he had stopped treating me like one years ago? It started when I was 21. My mother had been dead for 5 years by then, and I had just graduated from college. I came home to live with my father while I figured out my next steps. He seemed happy to have me back. Too happy. He started finding reasons to touch me, to hug me longer than necessary, to comment on how much I looked like my mother. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself he was just lonely. I told myself it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It escalated slowly, so slowly that I didn't notice the line being crossed until it was far behind me. A touch that lingered too long became a kiss on the forehead, became a kiss on the cheek, became something that made me want to crawl out of my own skin. He never forced me physically. He didn't have to. He had raised me to obey him, to trust him, to believe that fathers always knew best. By the time I realized what was happening, I was already trapped. I tried to leave once when I was 23. I packed a bag and drove to a motel 3 towns over. I lasted 2 days before the guilt overwhelmed me. He called me crying, saying he didn't know what he had done wrong, saying he couldn't live without me, saying he would hurt himself if I didn't come home. I went back. I always went back. He was my father and he needed me, and who else did he have since my mother died? The years blurred together after that. I got a job as a paralegal at a law firm downtown. I made friends, including Sarah. I dated occasionally, though nothing ever lasted, because how could I explain why I still lived with my father at 25, 26, 27. I learned to compartmentalize, to be one person at work and another person at home, to pretend that the thing that happened in that house happened to someone else entirely. But watching Sarah sign those divorce papers changed something in me. She had been trapped too, in a different way but trapped nonetheless. Her husband had manipulated her, gaslit her, made her believe that she was the problem. And she had finally said enough. She had finally chosen herself. She had finally walked away. If she could do it, maybe I could too. Maybe it wasn't too late for me. The next morning I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I knew what I needed to do. I couldn't just leave because he would find me, he would call me crying, he would guilt me into coming back like he always did. I needed to do something permanent. Something legal. Something that would sever the tie between us in a way that couldn't be undone. I went to work early and spent hours researching on my computer. What I found surprised me. There was a legal process called estrangement that wasn't exactly divorce but served a similar purpose for family relationships. More importantly, I discovered that what my father had been doing to me had a name. Coercive control. Emotional incest. Grooming. The words made me feel sick, but they also made me feel validated. This wasn't in my head. This was real and it was wrong and I had every right to escape it. I made an appointment with a family lawyer for the following week. I told no one, not even Sarah. I was terrified that if I said the words out loud, I would lose my nerve and go back to pretending everything was fine. I had gotten very good at pretending over the years. It was the only way I had survived. We stood there staring at each other, both of us before my appointment. My father cornered me in the kitchen between us, and we both knew it. He said I had been acting strangely. He asked what was wrong with me. He said he was worried about me. Nothing was wrong with me. He said he loved me more than anything in the world, and he couldn't stand the thought of losing me like he lost my mother. He said if this was about the thing we did sometimes, then he tried to kiss me on the mouth, I needed to remember that he loved me so hard, would never hurt me, and this was just how we expressed our bond. I said what we did was not normal. I said what we did was wrong. His face changed then. The loving father mask slipped and I saw something underneath that I had always known was there but had never let myself see clearly. He was angry. He was dangerous. He was not going to let me go without a fight. He took a step toward me and I took a step back and he smiled in a way that made my blood run cold. He said I could try to leave but I would regret it. He said no one would believe me because he was a respected surgeon and I was just his troubled daughter who had never been the same since my mother died. He said he had recordings and pictures that would ruin my reputation if I ever told anyone what happened between us. He said I belonged to him because he made me and raised me and nobody else would ever want me the way he did. I ran to my room and locked the door and sat with my back against it crying until I couldn't breathe. He knocked gently an hour later and said he was sorry for scaring me. He said he didn't mean those things. He said he just loved me so much that the thought of losing me made him crazy. He said he would be better. He said we could go back to how things were before. I didn't answer and eventually he went away. I didn't sleep that night. I packed a bag with everything important, my documents, my laptop, some clothes, the few pieces of my mother's jewelry that I had managed to keep from him. I waited until I heard him snoring in his bedroom down the hall and then I crept downstairs and out the front door. I drove to Sarah's apartment and rang her doorbell at 3 in the morning and when she opened the door, I collapsed into her arms and finally told her everything. Sarah held me while I sobbed out the whole ugly story. 7 years of manipulation and control and things I couldn't bring myself to describe in detail. She didn't interrupt or ask questions or tell me I should have told her sooner. She just held me and stroked my hair and said she believed me and that I was safe now. When I finally ran out of tears, she made me tea and set up the couch with blankets and said I could stay as long as I needed. The next morning I kept my appointment with the family lawyer. Her name was Patricia and she had kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that I found comforting. I told her everything, more than I had told Sarah, more than I had ever told anyone. She listened without judgment and took notes and asked clarifying questions. When I was done, she put down her pen and looked at me with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and determination. She said I had options. I could file for a restraining order based on the emotional abuse and manipulation. I could potentially press criminal charges depending on what exactly had occurred and when. I could pursue what she called a legal estrangement, which would formally sever my relationship with my father and give me legal protections against his attempts to contact or control me. She recommended we do all three. The process took months. My father hired his own lawyers and fought every step of the way. He painted me as mentally unstable, as a liar, as a troubled young woman who had misinterpreted a loving father's affection. His colleagues testified to his good character. His patients wrote letters about how he had saved their lives. He looked the judge straight in the eye and said he had never done anything inappropriate with his daughter and that he was heartbroken she would make such accusations. But I had evidence. Texts and emails where he had said things that no father should say to a daughter. Recordings I had made on my phone during our conversations that captured his manipulation and threats. Testimony from a therapist I had seen briefly in my mid-20s before my father made me stop going because she was filling my head with poison. The truth was ugly, but it was also undeniable. The restraining order was granted first. My father was not allowed to come within 500 feet of me or contact me in any way. He violated it within a week, showing up at my workplace with flowers and a tearful apology. The police escorted him away and he spent a night in jail. His hospital suspended him pending an investigation into his conduct. The investigation uncovered other complaints from nurses and colleagues about boundary issues that had been swept under the rug for years. The legal estrangement hearing was scheduled for 3 months after I filed. It felt strange to sit in a courtroom fighting to legally separate myself from my own father. The judge asked me to explain why I wanted this and I did, as clearly and calmly as I could manage. I said that my father had abused his position of trust and authority over me for years. I said that he had made our relationship into something it was never supposed to be. I said that the only way I could heal was to completely sever all ties to him. My father's lawyer argued that estrangement was an extreme measure, that family relationships should be preserved whenever possible, that I was clearly influenced by outside parties who wanted to destroy their bond. My father himself testified that he loved me more than life itself and would do anything to repair our relationship. He cried on the stand and several people in the courtroom looked at me with suspicion, wondering how I could be so cold toward such a devoted father. But the judge had seen the evidence. The texts where my father called me his soulmate and said no other woman could ever replace me. The emails where he described dreams about me that made me sick to read. The recordings where he threatened to hurt himself if I ever left him. The judge looked at my father with disgust and granted the estrangement with additional provisions that prohibited him from mentioning me publicly or attempting to contact me through third parties. Leaving that courtroom felt like taking my first real breath in 7 years. Sarah was waiting for me in the hallway and she hugged me so tight I couldn't breathe again, but this time in a good way. She said she was proud of me. She said I was the bravest person she knew. She said we were going to celebrate with expensive wine and terrible movies and no men allowed. The aftermath was complicated. My father lost his job at the hospital when the full scope of the investigation became clear. Other people came forward with their own stories about his inappropriate behavior, nurses he had touched, patients he had made uncomfortable, boundaries he had crossed that everyone had chosen to ignore because he was such a good surgeon. His reputation crumbled and I felt guilty even though I knew I shouldn't. His family, my family, split into camps. Some believed me and cut him off completely. Others believed him and cut me off instead. My grandmother, his mother, called me and said I had destroyed her son and she hoped I was happy. My aunt, his sister, said she always knew something was wrong and she was sorry she hadn't protected me. The family I had known my whole life fractured along lines I hadn't even known existed. Sarah helped me find my own apartment, a small one-bedroom in a building with good security and friendly neighbors. She helped me furnish it with things that were mine, not things my father had bought to keep me dependent on him. She helped me build a life that was my own for the first time since I was 21 years old. Every day felt like a small victory. I started therapy with a specialist who worked with survivors of family abuse. The sessions were brutal at first, forcing me to confront things I had spent years trying to forget. But slowly, painfully, I began to understand that what happened to me wasn't my fault. I hadn't seduced my father or led him on or misinterpreted his love. He had groomed me and manipulated me and taken advantage of the power he had over me as my parent. I was a victim, not a participant. The healing wasn't linear. There were days when I felt strong and free and grateful to be alive. There were other days when I couldn't get out of bed, when the shame felt like it would swallow me whole, when I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake by destroying my family. On those days Sarah would come over with ice cream and bad movies and remind me that I had done the right thing. She was the sister I never had. A year after the estrangement was finalized, I got a letter from my father. It had been forwarded through multiple addresses to avoid the legal restrictions on contact. He said he was sorry for everything. He said he understood now that what he did was wrong. He said he had started therapy and was working on himself. He said he hoped that someday I could find it in my heart to forgive him. He said he would always love me no matter what. I read the letter 3 times and then I burned it. Not because I was angry, though I was. Not because I hated him, though part of me did. I burned it because I knew that any response, even rejection, would give him hope. Would give him a foothold. Would start the cycle all over again. The only way to truly be free was to act like he didn't exist. To let him become a stranger. To mourn the father I wished I had and accept that the man who raised me was never really him. Sarah got engaged the following spring to a man she met at a bookstore. He was kind and funny and treated her like she hung the moon. I was her maid of honor and I cried through the entire ceremony. Not because I was sad but because I was so happy for her. She had escaped her bad marriage and found something real. She had proven that there was life after trauma. She had given me hope that maybe someday I could have that too. I started dating tentatively, carefully, with the help of my therapist to recognize red flags and trust my instincts. Most of the men were fine but forgettable. A few were terrible in ways that triggered all my old patterns and I had to work hard not to fall back into them. And then I met David at Sarah's wedding, a friend of her husband's who asked me to dance and actually listened when I talked and made me laugh in a way I hadn't laughed in years. We took things slow because I needed slow and he respected that completely. He knew about my past, the broad strokes if not the details, and he never pushed me to share more than I was ready to share. He met Sarah and passed her intensive screening process with flying colors. He remembered my coffee order and my favorite flowers and the names of all my coworkers even though he had only met them once. He felt safe in a way that I had never experienced with a man before. 2 years after I walked out of my father's house, David proposed to me on a beach at sunset like something out of a movie. I said yes and we both cried and Sarah screamed so loud when I called her that I had to hold the phone away from my ear. The ring was modest because David wasn't rich but I didn't care. He was honest and kind and he loved me for who I was, not for what he could take from me. That was worth more than any diamond. The wedding planning was complicated by my family situation. My father was obviously not invited but some relatives who still had relationships with him were upset by this. My grandmother refused to come if her son wasn't welcome. My aunt said she would come but couldn't promise she wouldn't mention him. In the end, my side of the wedding party was small. Sarah and her husband, a few friends from work, my therapist who had become something like a mother figure to me. It was enough. The day before my wedding, I received another letter from my father. This one had been hand-delivered to Sarah's apartment where I was staying, which meant he had tracked down her address despite the restraining order. The envelope was thick and my hands shook as I opened it. Inside were pages and pages of his handwriting, a stream of consciousness that veered between apology and accusation, love and rage, pleading and threatening. He said he had heard about my engagement and he was happy for me. He said he hoped this man would treat me better than he had. He said he regretted the mistakes he made and wished he could take them back. Then his tone shifted. He said I had ruined his life by making accusations that weren't true. He said I had misremembered things and blown them out of proportion. He said if I had really loved him I would have handled things privately instead of dragging him through the courts. He said my mother would be ashamed of how I had treated him. The mention of my mother made me cry. She had been gone for so long now that sometimes I couldn't remember her face without looking at pictures. What would she think if she knew what had happened after she died? Would she blame me for not stopping him sooner? Would she blame herself for leaving me alone with him? Would she believe me at all? I would never know, and that uncertainty was its own kind of grief. Sarah found me crying in her bathroom an hour later. She read the letter and her face went through several emotions before settling on cold fury. She said we were calling the police and reporting this violation of the restraining order. She said we were not going to let him ruin my wedding. She said she would personally burn down his house if he tried anything tomorrow. I laughed despite everything because Sarah's loyalty was the most constant thing in my life. The police took my statement and added the letter to my father's growing file. His lawyer had been working to get the restraining order reduced, but this violation would hurt his case significantly. I felt a grim satisfaction at that, even though I wished I could just forget he existed. He wouldn't let me forget. He would always find ways to remind me that he was out there, waiting, hoping I would come back to him someday. My wedding day dawned bright and beautiful. Sarah helped me into my dress and told me I looked like a princess. David cried when he saw me walking down the aisle. We said our vows and exchanged rings and kissed while our small group of guests cheered. It wasn't the big traditional wedding that little girls dream about, but it was mine and it was perfect. I was Mrs. David Chen now and nobody could take that away from me. The reception was at a small restaurant that we had rented out for the evening. We ate and drank and danced and laughed, and I felt genuinely happy in a way that I had forgotten was possible. David's parents welcomed me into their family with open arms even though they knew my own family was complicated. His mother hugged me and said she was gaining a daughter. I cried again because I hadn't had a mother in so long. Near the end of the night, I stepped outside for some air and found Sarah leaning against the wall smoking a cigarette she had sworn she quit months ago. She offered me one and I took it even though I didn't really smoke. We stood there in comfortable silence, two women who had both escaped bad situations and found their way to something better. She said she was proud of me. I said I couldn't have done it without her. We hugged and smeared our makeup and laughed about it. My father tried to crash my wedding. He showed up at the restaurant just as the party was winding down, somehow having figured out where we were despite our precautions. Security stopped him at the door and he made a scene, shouting my name and demanding to see his daughter. David's brothers escorted him outside while someone called the police. I hid in the bathroom with Sarah, shaking and crying, my perfect day ruined by the man who had ruined so many days before. The police arrested him for violating the restraining order again. This time the judge was not lenient. My father was sentenced to 6 months in jail, and when he got out, the restraining order was extended to 10 years and 500 feet was increased to 1,000. His medical license was permanently revoked due to his criminal record. The man who had been a respected surgeon was now an unemployed convict with no family and no future. I should have felt triumphant, but mostly I just felt tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of looking over my shoulder. Tired of explaining to new people why I didn't have parents at my wedding. Tired of the whole ugly mess that had become my life story. David held me at night when the nightmares came and said he would be my family now. He would be enough. We would build something new together, something untainted by my past. We moved to another city, partly for David's job and partly to get away from my father's shadow. We bought a house with a backyard and got a dog named Biscuit who was terrible at everything except being lovable. I found a new job and made new friends and slowly, tentatively, started to feel like a normal person with a normal life. The trauma was still there underneath, but it didn't define every moment anymore. Sarah and her husband moved too, coincidentally to a city only 2 hours away from ours. We saw each other once a month and talked on the phone constantly. She was pregnant with her first child and asked me to be the godmother. I cried when she asked and said yes immediately. Our friendship had survived so much and would survive whatever came next. She was my family by choice, the most important kind. 5 years after I walked out of my father's house, I got a phone call from a hospital. My father had been in a car accident and was in critical condition. They had found my name in his emergency contacts, an old listing from before everything happened. They wanted to know if I wanted to come say goodbye. He was probably not going to make it through the night. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after they hung up. David watched me from across the room, ready to support whatever I decided. Part of me wanted to go, to see him one last time, to get some kind of closure before he was gone forever. Another part of me thought he didn't deserve my presence at his deathbed. He had terrorized me for years and then tried to ruin my wedding. Why should I comfort him now? In the end, I didn't go. I stayed home with my husband and my dog and I let my father die without me. Sarah called to check on me and I told her I was okay, that I felt strange but not sad, that I didn't know how to mourn someone I had already grieved years ago. She said that was normal. She said I should feel however I needed to feel. She said she would come over tomorrow with wine and we would talk about it. My father's funeral was small and sad. A few distant relatives attended. His former colleagues mostly stayed away, not wanting to be associated with his disgrace. I watched from across the cemetery, hidden behind a tree, needing to see it for myself but not wanting to participate. When they lowered his casket into the ground, I felt something release in my chest. A tension I had been carrying for so long I had forgotten it was there. The inheritance was complicated because my father had never updated his will after our estrangement. Legally, I was still his only child and entitled to his estate. His lawyers contacted me with the details. The house I grew up in. His savings. His personal belongings. Everything that remained of the man who had raised me and then betrayed me. I donated all of it to charities that helped survivors of family abuse. I didn't want anything that came from him. Sarah had her baby, a beautiful girl with her mother's eyes and her father's smile. I held my goddaughter for the first time and cried at the weight of her in my arms. New life. New beginning. The cycle of abuse that had defined my family for generations stopped with me. I would never pass on that poison. My children, if I ever had them, would know only love and safety and respect. That was my father's true legacy, not his money or his house, but my determination to be nothing like him. I'm 43 now and my father has been dead for 8 years. The nightmares have mostly stopped. The therapy has helped me build a life I never thought I deserved. David and I have 2 children, a boy and a girl, who have never heard their grandfather's name. They know only that he's gone and that I don't like to talk about him. Someday when they're older I'll tell them the truth. For now they're innocent and I want to protect that as long as I can. Sarah is still my best friend. Her daughter is 13 now and calls me Auntie M. We joke that we're basically family at this point, closer than sisters, bound together by the shared experience of escaping men who tried to control us. She says she would never have found the courage to leave her ex-husband if I hadn't been there supporting her. I say I would never have found the courage to leave my father if she hadn't shown me it was possible. Sarah and I started a tradition after everything settled down. Every year on the anniversary of our divorce, we would go somewhere new together. Just the 2 of us, leaving our husbands and kids behind for a weekend of wine and laughter and remembering how far we had come. We called it our Liberation Day and it was sacred to both of us. The first year we went to a spa in the mountains. We got massages and facials and sat in hot tubs drinking champagne until we were giggly and pruned. We talked about everything and nothing, the way best friends do when they have been through war together. She told me about her fears of being a mother, of repeating her own mother's mistakes. I told her about my fears of being a wife, of trusting a man after what my father had done. We held each other's fears gently and promised to keep them safe. The second year we went to Paris because Sarah had always wanted to see the Eiffel Tower. We ate croissants for breakfast and macarons for lunch and drank wine with every dinner. We wandered through the Louvre and pretended to understand art. We took 100 photos of ourselves making silly faces in front of famous landmarks. My father had never let me travel because he said the world was dangerous for young women alone. Being in Paris felt like spitting in his face from across the ocean. The third year we went to a cabin in the woods where there was no cell service and no internet. Just us in nature and the sound of our own thoughts. We hiked during the days and made fires at night and talked about the men who had tried to break us. Sarah's ex-husband had remarried and had more children. She said she felt sorry for his new wife but also relieved that she was no longer his target. I told her about the letters my father kept sending from prison, each one more desperate than the last. She helped me burn them in the fireplace without reading them. The fourth year we went to a cooking class in Italy because Sarah had decided she wanted to learn to make fresh pasta. We were terrible at it, but we laughed so hard our stomachs hurt. The instructor was an old Italian grandmother who didn't speak much English but communicated through gestures and facial expressions that somehow made perfect sense. She reminded me of what a mother should be, warm and patient and encouraging without conditions. I cried in the bathroom that night and Sarah held me without asking why because she already knew. The fifth year we went skydiving because Sarah said we needed to do something that scared us. I was terrified the entire time, but when I jumped out of that plane and felt the wind rushing past me and saw the earth spread out below like a patchwork quilt, I understood why people did this. It felt like freedom. It felt like rebirth. It felt like proof that I could survive anything if I had survived the fall from my father's pedestal. Our Liberation Day trips became something our families expected and supported. David would take care of the kids and send me off with a kiss and a reminder to have fun. Sarah's husband did the same for her. They understood that this tradition was about more than just vacation. It was about celebrating our survival. It was about honoring the women we had become. It was about never forgetting what we had escaped. My children grew older and started asking questions about my side of the family. Why didn't they have grandparents like their friends did? Why were there no photos of mommy as a little girl in our house? Why did mommy sometimes get sad when other people talked about their fathers? I answered as honestly as I could without burdening them with details they were too young to understand. I told them that my parents had passed away and that it made me sad to remember them. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. When my daughter turned 10, she came home from school crying because a classmate had teased her about not having grandparents. She said everyone else had grandmas who baked cookies and grandpas who told stories and she had nobody. I held her and stroked her hair and told her that sometimes families looked different and that was okay. I told her she had Auntie Sarah and Uncle James and their kids who loved her like family. I told her that love was what made a family, not blood. But that night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed next to David and stared at the ceiling and wondered if I had done the right thing by cutting off my father so completely. He had been a monster to me, but he might have been a good grandfather. People changed sometimes, didn't they? Maybe prison had reformed him. Maybe he had finally understood what he did wrong. Maybe my children were missing out on something because of my inability to forgive. I shared these thoughts with my therapist at our next session and she looked at me with the patient expression she always wore when I was being foolish. She reminded me of the letters my father had sent, the ones I burned without reading. She reminded me of the wedding he tried to crash. She reminded me of the years of manipulation and control and boundary violations that had shaped my entire adult life. Then she asked me a question that stopped me cold. Would I let my children be alone with a man who had done those things to another child? The answer was obvious. No. Never. Not for a second. My father might have put on a good show for my kids, but underneath he was the same man who had groomed and manipulated me for years. The same man who saw his daughter as property to be owned rather than a person to be respected. The same man who had told me I belonged to him and threatened to destroy me when I tried to leave. That man could not be trusted with my children no matter how much time had passed. David found me crying in the kitchen that night and asked what was wrong. I told him about my daughter's question and my spiral of guilt and what my therapist had said. He listened quietly and then took my hands in his and said something that I have never forgotten. He said that protecting my children from my father was not cruelty. It was love. It was the purest form of love there was. My father had failed to protect me, but I would not fail to protect them. That was my victory over him. Sarah called me the next day to plan our Liberation Day trip for that year. She could hear something in my voice and asked what was wrong. I told her everything and she listened without interrupting. When I was done, she said that she had been having similar thoughts about her ex-husband, wondering if she should let him back into their daughter's life now that so much time had passed. She said her therapist had told her the same thing mine had. Some people don't deserve second chances. Some doors should stay closed forever. We decided to do something different for our 6th Liberation Day. Instead of going somewhere fun, we went to a retreat for survivors of family trauma. It was intense and emotional and nothing like our usual trips. We sat in circles with other women who had stories similar to ours. We listened and cried and shared our own experiences. We learned that we were not alone, that there were thousands of women just like us who had survived and thrived despite what had been done to them. One woman at the retreat told a story that haunted me for weeks afterward. She had reconciled with her abusive father after he got out of prison. She had believed him when he said he had changed. She had let him back into her life and eventually into her children's lives. And then one day she came home early and found him alone with her daughter in a way that made her blood run cold. The cycle had almost repeated itself. She had barely stopped it in time. That story confirmed what I already knew but needed to hear again. My father could never meet my children. Not because I was cruel or unforgiving, but because I knew who he really was underneath whatever mask he wore. The man who had groomed me would try to groom them too. The man who had seen me as his property would see them the same way. I could not take that risk. I would not take that risk. My children's safety was more important than any illusion of family reconciliation. My father died alone in a halfway house 3 years after getting out of prison. I found out through a cousin who had maintained contact with him despite everything. She said he had been sick for a while and had refused treatment. She said he had asked about me constantly, wanting to know if I was happy, if I had children, if I ever thought about him. She said his last words were my name. She seemed to think this information would bring me comfort. It didn't. I went to the cemetery alone on the 1st anniversary of his death. Not to mourn him but to make sure he was really gone. I stood in front of his grave marker, a small cheap stone that his remaining family had barely scraped together money for, and I waited to feel something. Grief, relief, anger, forgiveness, anything. But there was only emptiness. He had been dead to me for years before his body caught up with reality. His physical death was just a formality. I left a single flower on his grave, not out of love but out of obligation to the man he should have been. The father who should have protected me instead of preying on me. The father who should have been proud of my accomplishments instead of jealous of my independence. The father who should have walked me down the aisle instead of trying to crash my wedding. That man deserved a flower. The man buried beneath my feet did not. Sarah was waiting for me in the car when I came back. She had insisted on driving me even though I said I could do it alone. She knew me better than I knew myself sometimes. She knew I would need someone afterward to remind me that I was okay. That I had done the right thing. That surviving my father was an accomplishment worthy of celebration, not guilt. We drove to our favorite restaurant and ordered too much food and drank too much wine and laughed until we cried. She told me stories about her daughter's latest antics and I told her stories about my son's obsession with dinosaurs. We talked about our husbands and our jobs and the trip we were planning for next year's Liberation Day. We talked about everything except the grave I had just visited because some things didn't need words. My children are teenagers now. My daughter is 16 and looks so much like me at that age that it sometimes takes my breath away. My son is 14 and has his father's gentle nature and my stubborn streak. They know the truth now, most of it anyway. I told them when they were old enough to understand. I told them what their grandfather did and why I had to cut him out of my life. I told them that sometimes the people who should love us the most are the ones who hurt us the deepest. My daughter cried when I told her. She asked why anyone would do that to their own child. I said I didn't know, that I had spent years in therapy trying to understand and I still didn't have a good answer. Some people were broken in ways that couldn't be fixed. Some people confused love with ownership. Some people should never have been parents at all. My father was all of those things. My son was quiet for a long time after I told him. Then he asked if he was like his grandfather. If the bad things were passed down through blood. If he would grow up to hurt people the way his grandfather had hurt me. I held him so tight I thought I might break him. I told him that he was nothing like my father. That he was kind and good and gentle. That the choices we make define us, not the blood in our veins. That I had broken the cycle and he would never have to carry that weight. Sarah's daughter knows too now. She and my daughter are best friends the way Sarah and I are best friends. They don't share our trauma but they share our bond. They have sleepovers and inside jokes and a language that only they understand. Sometimes I watch them together and I see Sarah and me at that age, before everything went wrong, before we learned how cruel the world could be. I hope they never have to learn the lessons we learned. I hope their lives are easier than ours. But if they do face darkness, they will not face it alone. They will have each other. They will have us. They will have the knowledge that survival is possible, that healing is possible, that there is life after trauma. We have spent 20 years building proof of that. Our homes, our families, our careers, our friendships, all of it is proof that the people who tried to break us failed. All of it is proof that we are more than what happened to us. The day my best friend got divorced, I filed for divorce from my father too. That was 20 years ago and I have never regretted it. Not when he sent letters begging me to forgive him. Not when he showed up at my wedding trying to ruin it. Not when he died alone asking for me. Not when my children asked why they didn't have grandparents. Not once in 20 years have I wished I had made a different choice. Because the choice I made saved my life. It saved my children's lives. It broke a cycle that could have continued for generations. My father wanted to own me forever. Instead I owned myself. He wanted to define me. Instead I defined myself. He wanted to be the most important person in my world until the day he died. Instead he became a stranger I visited once in a cemetery and never thought about again. Sarah and I are planning our 21st Liberation Day trip. We're thinking about Japan this time because neither of us has ever been. Our husbands are pretending to complain about being left with the kids again, but we know they support us completely. Our children are old enough now to understand why this tradition matters. They know it's about more than vacation. They know it's about celebrating freedom. They know it's about honoring the women their mothers became. I am 51 years old and my father has been dead for 8 years and I am finally, completely, totally free. Not because he died, but because I chose freedom when he was still alive. I chose myself over his manipulation. I chose my future over his control. I chose to walk away when everything in my upbringing told me to stay. That choice was the hardest thing I've ever done. It was also the best. The day my best friend got divorced, I got divorced too. And I have been celebrating that divorce every day since. With every breath I take. With every smile I share with my children. With every kiss from my husband. With every laugh with my best friend. Every moment of my life is a celebration of the day I finally said enough. The day I finally walked away. The day I finally chose myself. That is my story. That is my victory. That is my life. And it belongs to me.